The quiet man at table 9 the morning at Maple Hollow Diner moved the way mornings always did in that small Ohio town, slow, warm smelling of burnt sugar and fresh coffee. Then, without warning, a large man slammed his shoulder into a corner table hard enough to send a mug crashing to the floor. Coffee splashed across the chest of the man sitting there. Laughter broke out instantly, the cheap kind, the kind that comes from people who think cruelty is funny when it isn't happening to them. The man in the soaked shirt didn't shout. He didn't even flinch. He rose slowly, set both hands flat on the table, and looked up, not with anger, but with something colder. Something that made the laughter die in people's throats before they even understood why. The whole diner went still in that single breath. Forks stopped clinking. A child's whisper got hushed by a nervous mother. Nobody moved. Nobody dared to. Who was this man? He had walked in 2 hours earlier, before the sun fully cleared the rooftops across Maple Street, and chosen that exact booth in the back corner for a reason most people would never notice. His back was to the wall. His eyes had a clean line to the door. He could see every face that walked in without turning his head. It was a habit, the kind you don't choose, the kind that chooses you and never quite lets go even years after the reason for it disappears. His name was Denzel Washington. 44 years old, lean in the way men get when they've spent decades training their bodies for purposes other than comfort. He wore a faded charcoal Henley, sleeves pushed to the elbow, and jeans that had clearly survived more than one rough season. Nothing about him invited conversation. His stillness wasn't emptiness, it was control, the kind of control that takes years to build and a lifetime to unlearn. On his left wrist sat a watch that didn't belong in any department store display case. Scratched steel, a cracked crystal he'd never bothered to replace, the kind of object men keep not because it still works perfectly, but because it survived something they did. He wasn't reading a paper, he wasn't on his phone, he was simply there, present, watching, the way some men never stop watching, even in a diner that smelled like maple syrup and freedom. Maple Hollow Diner was the kind of place locals loved precisely because nothing ever happened there. Strong coffee, eggs cooked the way you liked them without having to ask twice, pie that came from Ruth Calloway's own oven in the back. Denzel liked it because the mornings were quiet. He could think here, he could breathe here, he could forget, just for an hour, that the world had once asked everything of him, and that he had given it without complaint. His phone buzzed against the table, a message from his daughter. 12 years old, her name was Hope, don't forget. Pickup is 3:15. Love you, Dad. He typed back one-handed. Won't forget. Love you more than you know. He set the phone face down and looked out the window at Maple Street, waking up, a paper boy on a bike, a woman walking a golden retriever, the flag outside the hardware store snapping gently in the wind. Hope was the reason he was still breathing in any meaningful sense of the word. She was the reason he had walked away from a career most men couldn't even imagine, let alone survive. Her mother, Denzel's wife, Diane, had died when Hope was 6. Cancer, fast, merciless, the kind of disease that doesn't negotiate and doesn't wait for convenient timing. Denzel had been on deployment when it started. By the time the Army cut through enough paperwork to get him home, the doctors weren't talking in years anymore. They were talking in months. He held his wife's hand in a hospital room that smelled like antiseptic and goodbye, and 3 weeks after the funeral he walked into his commanding officer's office and resigned his commission. 16 years of service, gone in the time it took to sign one form. Nobody argued with him. Nobody asked him to reconsider. They understood. Some debts you don't get to choose between. Raising a 6-year-old alone turned out to be harder than anything he'd done in uniform. There were no clear objectives in fatherhood, no extraction plans, no backup arriving at the right moment, just him and a little girl who cried in the dark and asked questions he didn't have answers for. He learned anyway. He became the kind of father who figured out how to braid hair from YouTube tutorials at midnight, who memorized the names of every friend she ever mentioned, who never once missed a soccer game even when his body was running on fumes. By 8 in the morning, the diner had filled up the way it always did on a Saturday. Families with strollers wedged between booths. A couple of college kids from the community college spread their laptops across 2 tables they hadn't asked permission to combine. The espresso machine hissed. Someone's laugh rang out a little too loud. Denzel didn't mind. He'd spent years learning to filter noise, to separate the sounds that mattered from the ones that didn't. He was considering a second cup of coffee when the door swung open hard enough to rattle the bell above it. Grant Whitlock walked in like he already owned the place, like the building itself owed him something for the privilege of his presence. Tall, broad through the shoulders, somewhere in his late 30s, wearing a leather jacket despite the fact that it wasn't remotely cold enough to need one. Everyone in Maple Hollow knew Grant Whitlock, not because he'd done anything worth admiring, because he made absolutely certain you couldn't forget him. His family owned half the commercial real estate on Maple Street, including, as it happened, the building the diner sat in. Grant liked to remind people of that. He cut lines. He talked over waitresses. He made jokes at other people's expense and expected the room to laugh along. And mostly the room did, because laughing was easier than the alternative. Denzel had watched him before, watched the way he leaned too close to the young waitress, Becca, when he ordered. Watched the way he snapped his fingers at the busboy like the kid was furniture. It wasn't Denzel's business. He came here for coffee, not conflict. Grant walked past the counter without ordering anything. His eyes swept the room the way a predator's might, looking for something, anything, to feast on. They landed on Denzel. Something shifted behind Grant's eyes. Maybe boredom. Maybe the bottomless need some men carry to prove they're the most dangerous thing in any room they walk into. Denzel didn't look away. He held the gaze for exactly 1 second, then returned his attention to his empty mug, unbothered. That somehow was worse for Grant than if Denzel had glared back. Grant changed direction. His stride toward the corner booth was slow, deliberate, the walk of a man performing for an audience he hadn't even gathered yet. He shouldered between tables without a word of apology, forcing a young mother to yank her stroller out of his path. He didn't glance at her, didn't care. Denzel saw him coming and didn't move a muscle, hands flat on the table. Breathing, even. He'd met men like Grant Whitlock his entire adult life, men who mistook silence for weakness because they'd never once been still enough themselves to understand what stillness actually meant. Grant reached the booth. He didn't stop walking. At the last possible second, he twisted his hip and drove it directly into the edge of the table with enough force to send it skidding 3 inches across the tile. Denzel's mug toppled. Hot coffee sheeted across the table and down into his lap, soaking through denim, spreading warm and dark across his thigh. Grant stepped back, looked down at the mess he'd created, and grinned. It wasn't an apologetic grin. It was the grin of a man who'd done precisely what he set out to do and was savoring it. "Whoa," Grant said loud enough for the whole diner to hear. "My bad, man. Didn't even see you there." The lie hung in the air like smoke. Everyone within 15 feet had watched him walk directly into that table on purpose. There was no accident here. This was a man testing another man in public to see what would crack. Denzel looked down at the coffee soaking into his jeans. He looked at the puddle spreading across the floor tile. Then he lifted his eyes to Grant and said nothing. He simply waited. Grant's grin widened. He glanced around, gathering his audience. A few uncomfortable stares, a few curious ones, and near the window, a college kid already had his phone raised, filming. Grant fed on it like oxygen. He turned back to Denzel and shrugged with theatrical innocence. "You should probably clean that up," he said. He made no move to help, no move to leave. He just stood there, drinking in the silence, waiting for Denzel to do something he could mock. Something tightened in Denzel's chest. It wasn't anger, not yet. It was the thing that lives just before anger, the cold, careful calculation of whether a moment is worth the cost of responding to it. He thought of hope. He thought of the promise he'd made himself the night Diane died, that he would be there, steady, unshakable, that he would never again let old instincts drag him somewhere his daughter couldn't afford for him to go. But this wasn't instinct talking. This was something closer to the bone. Dignity. The line between keeping the peace and allowing yourself to be humiliated in front of a room full of strangers because humiliation was easier to swallow than consequence. Denzel had walked away from more fights than he could count. He'd swallowed more pride than most men ever taste in a lifetime because he understood that being a good father sometimes meant being the bigger man even when every cell in his body screamed otherwise. This felt different. This wasn't an accident. This wasn't a misunderstanding. This was deliberate, public, a challenge disguised as a clumsy apology. And if Denzel let it slide, Grant Whitlock would do this again. To someone smaller, someone older, someone who couldn't absorb it the way Denzel could. Denzel stood, slowly, deliberately. He didn't wipe the coffee from his jeans. He didn't reach for a napkin. He simply rose to his full height and met Grant's eyes directly. He wasn't as tall as Grant, wasn't as broad, but something in the way he carried himself, something coiled and quiet and absolutely certain, made Grant take an involuntary half-step back before he caught himself and squared up again, embarrassed at his own instinct. The diner went dead silent. "You think that's funny?" Zenzel said. His voice was low, even, almost gentle, which somehow made it land harder than shouting would have. Grant scoffed, glancing toward his audience for backup. "Relax, old man, it was an accident." "No," Denzel said, "it wasn't." A muscle ticked in Grant's jaw. The grin faltered for the first time, just slightly, like a crack spreading through ice. He hadn't expected pushback. Men like Grant rarely got it. Not real pushback, not the kind that didn't flinch. "You want to make something of it?" Grant said, stepping closer, chest puffed, voice climbing in volume to reclaim the room's attention. "Because I will absolutely embarrass you in front of everybody in here. I think," Denzel said, "you're about to embarrass yourself." That did it. Grant shoved him, both hands, square in the chest, hard enough to knock most men back a step. Denzel didn't move. His feet stayed planted like they'd grown roots through the tile. A woman near the counter gasped. Becca, behind the register, froze with a coffee pot still in her hand, her knuckles white around the handle. Grant shoved him again, harder, his face flushing red with the kind of fury that comes from being denied the reaction he was owed. "Move," he hissed. Denzel still didn't move. That was when Grant swung. It was a clumsy punch, loaded with rage, instead of training, telegraphed a full second before it landed anywhere near Denzel's face. Denzel shifted his weight, caught Grant's wrist mid-arc, and turned, one smooth motion, economical, almost bored in its precision, pinning Grant's arm behind his back and walking him forward into the wall beside the booth. Not slammed, not brutalized, controlled, the exact amount of force necessary and not 1 ounce more. "Let go of me." Grant bellowed, thrashing against a grip that didn't budge. "I will," Denzel said quietly, near his ear, "the second you stop trying to hit me." Grant kept struggling for another 10, 15 seconds, long enough for the whole diner to watch a man twice his apparent harmlessness completely neutralize someone built like a linebacker without throwing a single punch. Then the fight drained out of him all at once, the way air leaves a punctured tire. He went still, breathing hard, face mashed slightly against the wall, humiliation finally catching up to the bravado. Sirens were already wailing outside. Becca had dialed 911 the moment the first shove landed, her voice shaking as she gave the address. 2 cruisers pulled up outside Maple Hollow Diner within 4 minutes. A King officer came in first, hand near her belt, eyes sweeping the room. The crowd, the phones, the spilled coffee, the 2 men by the back wall, one breathing hard, one standing like stone. Behind her walked an older officer, gray at the temples, a face that had clearly absorbed more Saturday morning disturbances than he cared to count. His name tag read Dally. He moved slower than his partner, more deliberate, his eyes finding Denzel first and staying there a beat too long. Something passed across his face. Recognition, maybe, or the beginning of it. He murmured something to the younger officer. She nodded and moved toward Grant, who was now sitting in a chair, cradling his wrist and looking very small for a man who, 20 minutes earlier, had owned the room. Officer Daly approached Denzel with the loose, alert posture of a man who'd learned the hard way that assumptions get people hurt. "You want to tell me what happened here?" Daly asked. Calm, professional, no accusation baked into the question. Denzel met his eyes and held them, didn't fidget, didn't rush to explain himself, didn't perform innocence. He simply let the officer take him in, the same way Denzel had been reading the room since the moment Grant walked through that door. "He slammed into my table on purpose," Denzel said, nodding toward the corner booth. Coffee still pooling dark across the surface and dripping onto the tile. Then he shoved me twice, then he swung. Daly's eyes drifted to the stain spreading across Denzel's jeans, then to the watch on his wrist, and something in his expression shifted. Subtle, But Daly had seen that exact model of watch before, on exactly the kind of man who didn't talk about where he'd earned it. "What did you do?" Daly asked. "Restrained him," Denzel said. "Didn't hit him, didn't hurt him, just held him until he stopped fighting." Daly glanced over his shoulder. The younger officer had Grant against a different wall now, taking his ID, her voice low and businesslike. Grant looked deflated, all the bluster gone out of him like a popped balloon. Becca appeared at Daly's elbow, phone still in her trembling hand. "It's true," she said. "He came in and went straight for that table, slammed into it on purpose, started pushing him. We all saw it. An older man in a flannel shirt rose from a booth near the window, his wife releasing his arm to let him pass. He walked over with the careful steps of someone who didn't usually involve himself in other people's business but felt morally obligated to this time." "She's right," the man said, his voice rough with decades of hard living. "Big guy started it. This fella just defended himself. Didn't do one thing more than he had to." Daly studied Denzel again, really studied him this time, the way he stood. The way his eyes had tracked every movement in the room without his head ever turning the watch. The faded clothes that suggested a man who didn't spend money on appearances. The pieces clicked into place in Daly's expression, and Denzel could see it happening in real time. "You prior service?" Daly asked. It wasn't really a question anymore. Denzel nodded once. "Army, 16 years. Daly nodded slowly, like he'd gotten the answer he expected and didn't push for more. He turned and gave his partner a small hand signal. She nodded back and started walking Grant toward the door. "Am I being arrested?" Grant's voice cracked on the last word. All the bravado had drained out of him, replaced by something close to fear. "You're being removed for disturbing the peace," the younger officer said. "We'll talk outside." Grant glanced back at Denzel one final time before the door swallowed him, an expression tangled with humiliation, fear, and something that almost looked like respect, though he'd never admit it out loud. Daly turned back to Denzel. "You want to press charges?" Denzel shook his head. "Want a report filed?" Another shake. "You sure? We've got witnesses, probably got video too." Daly glanced toward the college kid still holding his phone. "We could build a real case here." "I'm sure," Denzel said. "I just want to go home." Daly studied him a long moment, then pulled a card from his jacket pocket and held it out. "If you change your mind, or if that guy ever comes around you again, you call me directly." Denzel took the card and slid it into his back pocket without glancing at it. Daly extended his hand. Denzel shook it. The grip was firm, the kind of handshake exchanged between two men who'd both seen things they didn't discuss in diners. "Thank you for your service," Daly said quietly. Then, raising his voice to the room, "Anyone who recorded video of this, I need it deleted right now. This isn't entertainment. This isn't content. Someone could have been seriously hurt today." The college kid looked down, tapped his screen a few times, then held it up to show the empty gallery. A couple of others around the diner did the same, quietly, without complaint. "Appreciate it," Daly said. He gave Denzel one last nod, then walked out. The cruiser lights faded as they pulled away from the curb. The diner exhaled. Conversation crept back in, quiet at first, then steadily louder. People returned to their coffee, their laptops, their ordinary Saturday mornings. But something in the air had changed. A lesson nobody had asked to learn, delivered anyway. Becca came over with a towel and handed it to Denzel without a word. He wiped down the table, dropped the towel in the trash, and checked his watch. Hours yet before he needed to pick up Hope, but he didn't want to stay here any longer, didn't want the stares, didn't want the questions. He walked to the counter. "How much do I owe you?" Becca shook her head. "It's on the house." "I'd rather pay." She looked at him, really looked, then nodded. "$3.50. He handed her a 5 and told her to keep the change. She smiled, small and genuine. "Thank you," she said, "for not making it worse." Denzel just nodded and turned for the door. The man in flannel raised his coffee cup slightly as Denzel passed, a quiet salute. Denzel returned the nod and kept walking. Outside, the air was clean and sharp. He climbed into his truck and sat for a moment, looking back at the diner through the windshield. People still inside, still drinking their coffee, still living their ordinary lives. The moment had passed. Grant was gone. The police were gone. Everything was sliding back toward normal, except it wasn't, not entirely. because now everyone in that diner understood something they hadn't an hour earlier, that silence isn't weakness, that stillness isn't surrender, that real strength has nothing to do with dominating a room and everything to do with controlling yourself even when you have every justification not to. That should have been the end of it. It wasn't. Grant Whitlock did not, as Denzel assumed, slink home and lick his wounds in private. Humiliated men with money and a grudge rarely do. By Monday morning, Grant had convinced himself an entirely different story was true, one where he was the victim, where some stranger had attacked him unprovoked in a diner his own family practically owned. He told this story to his father, Walter Whitlock, who owned the building, 3 more storefronts on Maple Street, and enough influence in the town council to make most people nervous about crossing him. Walter didn't ask many questions. He never had to. When his son came home with a bruised ego and a story that painted him as wronged, Walter's instinct wasn't to verify, it was to retaliate. It started small. A notice taped to the diner's front window on Tuesday, a 30-day lease violation warning, citing a building code issue nobody had ever mentioned before. Becca called Ruth Calloway, the diner's owner, in a panic. Ruth called her lawyer, who confirmed what everyone already suspected. The violation was manufactured, timed exactly to the Saturday morning incident. Then it got personal. Denzel found out on Wednesday evening, when Hope came home from school crying. A boy in her class, Tyler Whitlock, Grant's nephew, had told the entire 7th grade that Hope's father was a dangerous man who'd beaten up his uncle in public, that he was unstable, that her dad might snap someday. Kids had started keeping their distance from her at lunch. One girl asked Hope, with the brutal bluntness only children possess, if she was scared to live with him. Denzel sat on the edge of her bed that night while she cried into her pillow, and something in his chest went cold and hard in a way it hadn't in years. He had absorbed insults aimed at himself his whole life without blinking, but this was aimed at his daughter, and it landed somewhere he hadn't built defenses for. He didn't raise his voice, he didn't make threats, he simply held her until she fell asleep, then sat alone in his kitchen for a long time, turning Officer Daly's card over in his hands. He didn't call, not yet. Denzel had learned a long time ago that the first move in any real conflict is never the loud one. The next blow came Thursday. Denzel worked part-time doing maintenance and security consulting for a logistics company on the edge of town, Hartwell Freight. Steady, unremarkable work that let him be home every afternoon by 3. His supervisor called him into the office that morning, looking deeply uncomfortable, and told him the contract was being terminated, effective immediately. No real explanation given, just a vague mention of concerns raised by a community member about his temperament. Denzel didn't need 3 guesses. Walter Whitlock had connections on the board of the company that contracted Hartwell's logistics work, and a single phone call had been enough to end a job Denzel had held without a single complaint for 2 years. He drove home that afternoon with his jaw tight, hand steady on the wheel, replaying every version of restraint he'd shown in that diner and wondering for the first time if restraint had been a mistake. It wasn't restraint that was the mistake, it was assuming Grant Whitlock would let it end there. By Friday, the whispers around Maple Hollow had curdled into something uglier. Someone, Denzel suspected Grant himself, had started a rumor that Denzel had a history of violence overseas, that he'd been discharged for incidents, that parents should think twice before letting their kids near a man like that. None of it was true. Denzel's discharge papers, sitting in a folder in his closet, told a very different story. Commendations, a Bronze Star 16 years of exemplary service, ended by compassionate separation after his wife's death. But rumors don't ask for paperwork, they just spread. Hope's school called Friday afternoon. A concerned parent had raised questions about Hope's home environment with the front office, prompting a mandatory welfare check from a school counselor. Denzel sat across from a kind, clearly uncomfortable woman named Mrs. Patterson, answering questions about his daughter's safety and stability with a calm he didn't fully feel, watching 12 years of careful, devoted fatherhood get reduced to a checkbox on a form because one humiliated rich man's son couldn't accept losing a fight he started. That night, after Hope was asleep, Denzel finally pulled Daly's card from the drawer where he'd set it and called the number printed on the back. Daly picked up on the third ring, his voice rough with sleep but immediately alert when he recognized the name. "It's escalating," Denzel said simply. "I think I know who's behind it. I want to do this the right way, but I need you to understand what's happening before it gets worse." Daly listened without interrupting as Denzel laid it out. The manufactured building violation, the job termination, the rumors targeting his daughter, the welfare check built on nothing but malice. When Denzel finished, there was a long silence on the line. "Come down to the station tomorrow morning," Daly finally said. "Bring whatever paperwork you've got, and Denzel, don't engage with the family directly. Not yet. Let me work this from the right angle." Denzel agreed. He hung up the phone and sat in the dark kitchen a long time, thinking about Diane, about the promise he'd made her grave, about the difference between a man who fights for himself and a man who fights for the people who depend on him. The first kind he could walk away from. The second kind he couldn't, not anymore. Daly, it turned out, had been a patrol officer in Maple Hollow for over 20 years, long enough to have watched Walter Whitlock buy his way out of more inconveniences than the public ever heard about. He'd also, as it happened, served 2 tours in the Army Reserve decades earlier, and something about watching a fellow veteran get quietly destroyed by a spoiled bully's father offended him on a level far deeper than procedure. He didn't go through official channels alone. He went to the local paper. Sandra Voss, a reporter for the Maple Hollow Gazette, who'd spent the better part of a decade chasing stories nobody else wanted to touch, took the lead Daly gave her and ran with it like a bloodhound catching scent. She filed records requests on the building violation, discovering it had been issued by an inspector who, records showed, had received a consulting payment from a Whitlock-owned LLC 2 days prior. She tracked the logistics company contract termination back to a single phone call logged from Walter Whitlock's office. She interviewed Becca, the man in flannel, whose name, it turned out, was Earl Buchanan, a decorated Vietnam veteran himself, and 3 other diner witnesses, all of whom confirmed on the record exactly what had happened that Saturday morning. The story ran the following Thursday under the headline, "Local developer used influence to punish veteran, defended himself from his son." It detonated through Maple Hollow like a bomb nobody saw coming. By Friday morning, it had been picked up by a regional news outlet. By Saturday, a producer from a statewide news station was parked outside the diner asking Becca for an on-camera interview, which she gave without hesitation, describing in detail exactly what Grant had done and exactly how Denzel had responded, restrained, controlled, never throwing a single punch even when he had every right to. Walter Whitlock's business partners began quietly distancing themselves within days. 2 tenants in his commercial properties announced they wouldn't be renewing their leases. The town council, suddenly very aware of how this looked with an election cycle approaching, opened an ethics inquiry into the manufactured building violation and the inspector who'd issued it, who, facing the loss of his license, flipped almost immediately and confirmed under oath that Walter had paid him to fabricate the citation. Hartwell Freight, mortified at having fired a model employee over what turned out to be outside pressure from a man now under public scrutiny, called Denzel personally to apologize and offered to reinstate him with back pay. Denzel accepted, not out of vindictiveness, but because the job had been honest and he needed the income, and he'd never once let pride get in the way of providing for his daughter. Grant Whitlock, meanwhile, was unraveling in full public view. The video the college kid had supposedly deleted from his phone that Saturday morning turned out to exist in a cloud backup he'd forgotten about, and when a friend of his, disgusted by the rumors Grant had spread about Denzel afterward, leaked it anyway, the footage went viral within 48 hours. Millions of views. The internet, never gentle, tore Grant apart in the comment section with a kind of merciless clarity reserved for bullies caught in their own lies. His name became a punchline. His father's business reputation collapsed under the weight of the ethics scandal. The assault charge Grant had avoided that first Saturday, back when Denzel declined to press charges, was reopened by the district attorney's office once the full pattern of retaliation came to light, this time not just for the initial assault, but for witness intimidation tied to the rumors spread about Denzel and his daughter. Grant Whitlock stood in a courtroom 3 months later, stripped of the bravado that had once filled an entire diner with noise. His lawyer had negotiated a plea, community service, a fine mandatory anger management, and a restraining order keeping him away from Denzel and Hope. The judge, unimpressed by Walter Whitlock's attempts to pull strings that no longer reached as far as they used to, made a point of noting on the record that wealth was not a substitute for accountability. Walter Whitlock, facing his own separate investigation into bribery and ethics violations, lost his seat on 3 regional business boards within the year. The Whitlock name, once untouchable on Maple Street, became synonymous with exactly the kind of small, ugly cruelty it had spent decades hiding behind money. After the sentencing, in the hallway outside the courtroom, Grant approached Denzel, alone, without his father, without an audience to perform for. He looked for the first time since Denzel had ever seen him genuinely young, lost. "I don't expect you to forgive me," Grant said quietly, his eyes on the floor. I wanted to say I'm sorry. For all of it, your daughter didn't do anything. None of this was supposed to touch her." Denzel studied him for a long moment, the same way he'd studied him that first morning in the diner, reading what was real and what wasn't. "You spent your whole life," Denzel said finally, "thinking strength meant making people smaller than you. It doesn't. It never did. The strongest thing you could have done that morning was just say sorry and mean it." He paused. "You've got a long road back from this. Whether you walk it or not is the only thing that's actually up to you now." He didn't offer forgiveness. He didn't owe it. But he didn't offer cruelty either, because cruelty had never been the lesson he was trying to teach. Not to Grant, not to the diner full of strangers who'd watched a quiet man refuse to become exactly what was being done to him. Life in Maple Hollow slowly found its rhythm again. Ruth Calloway's diner not only kept its lease, the building code investigation cleared her completely, and the fabricated violation was struck from the record, but found itself busier than ever, locals and out-of-towners alike stopping in, half out of curiosity, half out of quiet solidarity with the story that had unfolded within its walls. Becca got a raise and, eventually, enough confidence to enroll in night classes she'd been putting off for years. Earl Buchanan started showing up most mornings just to sit near the corner booth, like a man standing guard over a small piece of justice that had finally gone the right way. Hope's classmates, once the truth came out in full, treated her differently, not with pity, but with something closer to quiet respect. Tyler Whitlock, humiliated by his own uncle's exposure, mostly kept his distance after that, and Hope, in the resilient way children often surprise the adults who underestimate them, simply moved forward without needing an apology from a 12-year-old who'd only ever repeated what the adults around him modeled. Denzel went back to work at Hartwell Freight, back to his quiet mornings at the diner, back to being parked outside Hope's school every single day at exactly 3:15, rain or shine, without fail. He never told the story himself, never gave an interview, never posted anything online, never let the moment turn into the kind of self-mythology some men might have built from it. When people in town brought it up, he changed the subject, gently but firmly, the same stillness in his eyes that had stopped Grant Whitlock cold that first Saturday morning. Because the lesson, as far as Denzel was concerned, was never about him. It was about the simple, almost forgotten truth that real strength has nothing to do with how loud you are, how much money your family controls, or how many people laugh at your jokes. It's measured in the quiet moments, in choosing restraint when you have every right to rage, in refusing to let cruelty win even when cruelty is winning everywhere around you, in showing up at 3:15 every single day for the one person who needs you most. Grant Whitlock learned that lesson the hardest way a person can, publicly, painfully, and at a cost that followed him long after the cameras left. Denzel Washington never needed to learn it. He'd known it all along. He just needed the world for one Saturday morning to finally see it too.